questions of social and spatial inequality, the experiences of marginalized groups, and social justice in the city, and is also interested in the role of nonprofit sector in assisting immigrants and refugees in the settlement process. Her research and teaching interests address issues of globalization, transnationalism, citizenship, and governments. And then we have Huan Wang, who is a PhD candidate at the Henan Agriculture University in China. She is currently is a visiting student researcher in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Ottawa under the supervision of Louisa. So please, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphane. Ça me fait très plaisir de vous revoir. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you to the two previous presentations that were amazing and to set the tone and the ground. So I will be doing the presentation, but I want to acknowledge that Juan did a lot of the analysis, and I think on the call there's also Magali Escandon Lopez, who's an exchange student from Mexico, who helped us with the gender analysis. So this project has been done in collaboration with OLIP, so it relates quite a bit to what Christina and Muna just presented, and it was funded by the BMRC partnership. It's also done in collaboration with Christina Gabriel. So this project was identified as a study that OLIP wanted us to do to better understand the context of Ottawa-Gatineau and labor market integration of newcomers because of the complexity of a region, the fact that it's an interprovincial metropolitan area with asymmetrical bilingualism, among other things. And our project also builds on a recent report Brian Ray published using census data, and he did a very detailed analysis of immigrants' labor market experiences that shows some unique trends to the unique post-industrial context, with the federal government being the main employer and many of the jobs being surrounding around the federal government needs. So Ottawa-Gatineau has one of the highest median incomes in the country, and it also attracts immigrants with the highest levels of education, especially skilled workers. So we wanted to probe a little more with a qualitative lens and understand the role of gender, the place of origin, the type of occupation, as well as the role of language in labor market experiences among newcomers. So the main objectives is to understand the role of language and gender in the unique context of Ottawa-Gatineau's labor market. But for this presentation today, the focus will be more on the impacts of the pandemic, particularly the challenges and strategies they deployed, because half of our participants arrived, they're all newcomers, but half arrived in the years before the pandemic, and the other half arrived a few months or during the pandemic. So there's an opportunity to do a comparative study. And we're still working on the analysis, but we've done a bit more than last fall, and we see some interesting trends emerging, particularly with regard to the role of social networks and the use of social media. And to some extent, I don't know how to put it, I don't want to say we don't have amazing findings or interesting findings. I think we still need to probe a little bit more, but what is emerging are some interesting success stories that I think will be useful, particularly to settlement services who support newcomers, to identify some promising practices based on the experiences of some of our participants. So the project was collaborative in nature and was conceptualized initially with OLIP, and is part of the Building Migrant Resilient Cities partnership. We attended a number of OLIP's employment or labor market sector tables, and so we built the project based on what we heard in those conversations, which happened before the pandemic. We were delayed in our data collections, so we were able to conduct the interviews finally last summer, and we conducted the bulk of it in July and August, and some throughout the fall. So the data are very recent and gave us the opportunity to have some time since the initial stages of the pandemic. So we have a bit of a longer perspective on the impacts. The goal was to recruit 40 newcomers, equally divided between men and women, who had English and French as first official language, coming from diverse countries of origins, but who arrived specifically through the skilled worker or family reunification category. So these are highly skilled, highly educated immigrants. And further probing based on Brian's report, we also did a small pilot and tried to recruit immigrants who were in the STEM-related professions, who appear to have a very unique trajectories, and this is actually confirmed in our findings. In terms of the analysis, I don't have like a specific conceptual framework, but we draw from the social resilience approach that has been adopted through the partnership. For this particular analysis, we focus very much on intersectional identities, specifically, I mean, they're all skilled workers, highly educated, but from different countries with different language skills, French and English. There is gender, different occupations, and also the role of social networks, which emerges as a very significant trend. We have done the coding using NVivo in multiple stages, starting with the main themes of our interview guide, but we also open to emerging themes from the interviews. The presentation today focuses more specifically on the English-speaking participants. For a number of reasons, we didn't have time to do all of the analysis in both languages. Also, we have fewer participants in French, and I'm still hoping to recruit a few more participants. So the data and the analysis I will show you is based on 25 interviews with English-speaking participants. Among these, 5 were in the STEM fields, and they come from any of the world regions that you see listed there. So they're highly diverse in terms of origins. And I want to stress that many of them were multilingual, had already had experiences studying abroad in English or in French. And in a way, one thing we see emerging is kind of a cosmopolitan resilience, in the sense of people who have already extensive experience of traveling and studying and speaking multiple languages. And the more they have these qualities, the more successful and rapidly they've been able to access jobs. So just for the French, there are 10 participants so far, but I haven't done as complete an analysis. So for the English speaking, I wanted to illustrate their immigration category and gender. So the majority came as skilled workers with almost equal numbers men and women. Slightly more women arrived under the family reunification. In terms of time of arrival, as I mentioned, about half arrived before the pandemic. So from 2016 to about 2019. And if you arrived in the 6 months before the pandemic or during the pandemic, with some variations in terms of gender. With regard to levels of education, they're all highly educated with bachelor degrees, master's degrees, and some PhDs. And with regard to language, these were self-rated levels of proficiency. All have very strong English language skills. You can see that a majority didn't have French as little or no knowledge, but a few did have some knowledge in French. And I guess one key finding is that those who are bilingual generally do by far much better in the labor market, but we notice among the Francophones, those who don't speak English, the impact was really significant, but it was less so for those who spoke English. So just an overview, this is a qualitative study, so the data are not representative, but to give you a sense of their employment status based on time of arrival. Those who arrived before the pandemic were better represented among those who were employed in their field, and who didn't have a job. Both were women. One, in fact, had just had a baby and decided to quit her job because it wasn't a job in her field. It wasn't worth it, and she was going to start from scratch, and one was self-employed. In contrast, those who arrived during the pandemic, we see that 4 managed to get a job in their field, although not necessarily exactly what they wanted. And we have slightly more who were self-identified as being underemployed and overqualified for those positions. Nevertheless, based on the data, we can't really tell whether it's the impact of the pandemic or related to the time of arrival. They had been here for less than 2 years. So we can't really distinguish really whether it's a matter of time or the impacts of the pandemic. Stefan, you can tell me to stop if I'm going over time, because I have no idea how long this is going to be. So I have 3 main themes. I want you to tell a little bit about the impacts of the pandemic, some of the challenges that our participants encountered, and the most interesting part of our findings is the labor market strategies. In terms of impacts of the pandemic, in the interview guide, we had 2 different sections, and I still have yet to put them together. One asked them more specifically, what was the impact of the pandemic? And generally, those who arrived before the pandemic had slightly less significant impacts. The main impacts were stress. One person quit her job because she was working as a tutor and was exposed to hundreds of students every week, and so she quit because she was worried. Nevertheless, they had less significant impacts, such as working from home or juggling children and work. Among those who arrived during the pandemic, there were more who reported significant impacts, in particular challenges to network in order to access jobs, challenges with their job search because they arrived in a context of pandemic, and a significant numbers said they don't really know Canada without the pandemic. And so their perceptions of Canada were skewed, as the quote suggests, "I honestly don't know how is Ottawa without COVID." So this was a significant challenge in terms of social relations and workplace culture and so on. In terms of the challenges that our participants encountered, they listed a range that we grouped. So language was among the most significant impacts, but most of it were around language norms and accents. Many spoke about the issue of Canadian experience that you're all familiar with. Some spoke of lack of familiarity with Canadian labor market, especially in a pandemic context, or lack of familiarity with workplace culture, how to relate to colleagues or bosses. A few mentioned training and accreditation issues. This was in a different section of the interview guide, where when we asked them about challenges in the labor market, they explicitly cited issues relating to the pandemic. Then some spoke of lack of social networks, a few on issues of discrimination, and a couple spoke of immigrant status, but fairly vaguely. So I'm not going to illustrate all of those. I wanted to focus on
3 minutes, Lisa, 3 minutes.
Parfait. The impacts and challenges directly relating to the labor market were, this is one finding that I would like to explore more. It wasn't always clear whether the pandemic had a direct impact or rather it was a perception. And I think for a lot of participants, one challenge will be that probably they themselves will never know whether the challenge was the labor market or the lack of networks, or whether the pandemic was exacerbating, influencing, or skewing their experiences. So I think there's something to explore there, because it wasn't always clear if their experience would have been different, let's say when they spoke of lack of Canadian experiences or challenges to access volunteering jobs. So they said, you know, I tried, I sent my CV, but I didn't hear back. I'm not sure, is it due to the pandemic? So I think this doubt, or a lot of it is perceptions, but not sure. And in a way, I think there's something interesting there to probe around the level of influence. Maybe we can't, but I think there's something interesting whether they could simply say, oh, it was because of the pandemic. In terms of the labor market strategies, as I said, there's some really interesting findings here. Most of the participants used a variety of strategies, which I think is where I'd like to pursue the analysis further. So the main strategies were using settlement services, mobilizing social networks, and using the internet and social media. The other two were just individual cases that were not very prominent. In the time remaining, I'll try to tell you about settlement services. So there were a variety of reasons why they were using settlement services. But the main things were just general advice, information, particularly around CVs and interviews and how to network. And they received a lot of advice around the role of networking and also volunteering, for example. One key finding, we found differences between men and women in using settlement services. And here, I guess, a bias from our sample is that we recruited the English-speaking participants through WorldSkills. So obviously, a lot of them had used WorldSkills, but what really stood out was women used the settlement services more extensively, and many of them were able to land a job through the programs that they used at WorldSkills, specifically a new program empowering visible minority newcomer women. And our participants who went through that program got a job and were very happy with the job. So I think this is a very significant finding for WorldSkills and probably for all it. Something I still want to look at, men were less keen on using settlement services, so they had a perception that they were not useful or they were not landing jobs. So we see a significant gender difference around the settlement services. About social networks, a main finding has been that generally newcomers feel networks are important to land that first interview, to land a job. And there was some differences. Those who arrived after the pandemic definitely put social networks on the fore, and those who got jobs was usually through social networks, someone that put a good word for them, and they used various types of social networks, acquaintances, family, and friends. Many also relied on ethnic communities or religious networks, and some worked hard at their professional networks, including before coming to Canada. So I have some quotes I'm going to skip, and just to conclude, because I see Stefan arrived, there is a lot of overlap between our social network data and the use of social media. And this is something else I'd like to probe a little further. So most participants use social media. Some were using them before coming to Canada. Others started using them when they arrived in Canada, including because settlement services told them to use them. But we see STEM participants farther ahead than anyone else with regard to using social media, including before coming to Canada and even landing jobs or having a job offer before making it to Canada. So this is something that is highly promising. So I had slides to show you the different uses of social media. Most of them used them, found them useful. A handful didn't like them, didn't find them useful, didn't get responses or interviews. So we clearly see social networks as an influential factor in their labor market experiences, the differences across occupations and language. Gender, we're still looking, I don't see yet very clear differences. The pandemic had varied impacts. Generally, those who arrived during the pandemic were more impacted, but as I said, it's not clear whether it's a perception or a real impact. And lastly, what seems promising is the combination of strategies that our participants use that I'd like to examine further and compare with Francophones. So I'd like to thank our partners, our team, and the BMRC, and feel free to contact me if you have questions. Thank you, and looking forward to hearing any questions.
Oh, merci beaucoup, Louisa. There are some questions in the chat, but we'll maybe first listen to Juan, her presentation, and then we'll get to the questions.
So Juan was presenting